Good afternoon, everybody. This week I moved a few things around and I moved some of our conversations about social media and the news and citizen journalism up in our syllabus and moved a couple of things later on, in part because of some of the projects that you guys have decided to undertake based on our meetings and your proposals. And also just because I think, obviously, in the moment that we're in right now, there's a lot to be said and a lot to think about how we get our news, how we experience the news, the impact of it, and how social media is now part of that process. We have two chapters from a book and also this academic article today called Incidental News: How Young People Consume News on Social Media. And this was a collaborative effort, and they're out of one is out of the Universidad de San Andres, and the other is Northwestern University. And so they were pretty young researchers at the time of the publication of this article, looking at how people engage with social media as a means of getting the news primarily. I'm curious, and it'll come up for hopefully for all of you on your discussion post, how we think about this to see if it still resonates for us in the same way, or if there's something that we can point to that feels really different for the way we do things now, whether it's 5 or 10 years on from the publication of the article. So what they did was they tracked how news was shaped by social media usage. So according to Pew Research, Pew is one of the largest national research centers. It is a large-scale data collection organization. So basically, it's a space where a lot of researchers who, especially younger researchers who might be early in their careers, tend to gather data from because there are pre-existing data sets that they can use to work with for their article. So this is not research that was conducted independently for the purpose of this article. They use existing data. And I just think it's always important to talk about that and think about what that sometimes might mean, because it means that there's a utilization of existing data that gets then shifted in how it's framed to some extent by how researchers are utilizing it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not accurate. A big part of what we're thinking through in this course together is the process of inductive research. And in other words, letting what we find existing in the spaces that we're observing, or in this case, in data sets, determine how we frame a research question, right? It's problematic to go into an existing data set with a firm research question already in mind that wasn't the research question that was brought to that group of people that were interviewed. And we saw how that kind of got problematic in the way that Sarah Conrath in her work on reducing empathy in college students had some problematic implications, because there were assertions made after the fact or research questions that were made after the fact that had less to do with what the data was telling her than a change in interest in what was being studied at the time. But in this case, so they found a large amount of research from Pew Research showing that 62% of adults are getting their news from social media. And that in that context, that people who skewed younger in the group of people that were, because one of the data sets that they collected along with those interviews was what age people were, right? So they just disaggregated the information based on age group. And it showed that young people in particular turned to social media over traditional channels for information. And that this is an understudied condition of how people are engaging with the news, and that they're arguing in favor of this being given more attention. In response to this being an understudied field or area, they set out to do a study. And I wanted to point out to you guys that this is a really manageable study. If any of you are really interested in continuing in the kind of research that we're doing in this class, and some of you had some interesting ideas about wanting to do interviews, I pointed out when we had our conversations that unfortunately, because the Institutional Review Board requires permissions for studies of human subjects, even if it's qualitative interviews, in order to ensure that things are anonymous, et cetera, and even if those things are conducted in online surveys, unless they're like mass scale, if there's any kind of individual identifying information in the way that social media platforms usually afford, those things have to be approved by IRB. So I had to redirect a couple of you who seemed to really be interested in doing interviews into doing something more observational based. And I just wanted to point out that this study, which is a published study, we're using it to talk about something in a college level course, was a really small group of people, right? They only talked to 16 different people in order to attempt to begin to ask questions to fill the gaps in this emergent information about young people's use of social media. And this was back in 2017. So a while ago, but not crazy long ago, right? And this is the kind of thing that if you guys are interested in doing it in future classes, when you're, whether in later years of your undergrad or master's programs, this is very doable research that you can also publish. And if any of you have any interest in working up what you're writing for this course into something that you'd like to publish, I'd be happy to talk to you about how to do that. Okay, back to our article. So they conducted these 16 open-ended interviews, and they usually, youth groups, youth marketing groups are confined to 18 to 24, 18 to 25. They extended a little longer to 18 to 29. And they did these interviews in Argentina between March and June of 2016 and asked how people are relating to the news and how they're doing so through social media. And in order to process the information that they're getting in these qualitative interviews, just like you're going to have to figure out how to read the data that you're getting in your observational data and how you're going to analyze that, they have a theoretical frame that helps them do that. Just like you're going to choose a theoretical frame from one of our readings that's going to help you determine what you're talking about, how you're seeing it. And in this case, they take the theory of texto-material perspective as a kind of mixed theoretical frame methodology of how they're approaching their data. And this originates with someone named Witowski. I'm going to have said that incorrectly. And Siles, and their project called At the Intervention of Content and Material, a texto-material perspective on the use of media technologies. And that's a communications theory publication. So what a texto-material perspective means is that it looks at issues of technological infrastructures and actions, content configurations, and the agency of users in weaving technology and content together in their everyday practices. That's a lot. That's a lot of language to get at what they're trying to say is that, as we've talked a lot about this semester already, there are people who tend to read things through more of a political economic framework, looking at the systems. There's also people who specifically look at structures and technological infrastructures and how they're designed and want to have conversations about affordances. And that can veer sometimes into a kind of technological determinism, right? Which we remember back to that term, meaning that certain kinds of technological projects, affordances, practices dictate certain kinds of behaviors. And this kind of leaves agency out. Both technological determinism and political economy reads can on occasion forget to include the agency of actors and how they engage with things. This is looking at how you use social media, how you use these devices as part of your everyday life, and how that happens in a material way related to how that technology comes into being, how it's made, how it exists. So it's not abstract either. So they're just trying to make this make sense in a more grounded way, in a materially grounded way. So a couple things they found was that primarily young people that they were talking to got the majority of their news through their mobile, through their phones, over television or newspapers or other forms of media. And that specifically they were finding their news primarily through social media platforms. This article, again, because it's a little bit older, it was primarily Facebook that people were getting that information from and posting articles there. Facebook was really popular for posting legacy media. Twitter still does this too. What I mean by that is that it links to an article that exists on a website of a legacy or traditional media newspaper site. And so it's still connected to the traditional modes of media production. I think this article largely precedes a lot of what's happened since, where people are foregoing official news sites at times in favor of understanding what's happening in world events from other individuals. And we'll talk about that next week when we talk about citizen journalism. And also through things like people's TikToks and other personal experiences, right? So this is a specific kind of time period and context. And we're still talking about people reading official news. They're just accessing it in a different way. They also found that the ideal typical mode in which young users consume news on social media is characterized as incidental, meaning that they're scrolling, right? They're on a social media platform, again, in this case, mostly Facebook, looking at other stuff, not necessarily intentionally seeking out news. And news kind of comes through in other processes. So it means they encounter news media through scrolling casually on phones or tablets, and that this kind of also shifts the kinds of news that people end up being exposed to differently than if one was to go out and buy a legacy paper, like a printed legacy paper, or even go to the website of a newspaper, right? Intentionally. That's a different experience than what the algorithm or your social network connections are going to bring you through a platform like Facebook. The other thing that they find is that there is a shift that's happened in habit of news media consumption. And they say that previously news consumption was habitual, that the interpretation and practices whereby people get the news would also pertain to other domains in their lives, and the adoption of specific routines to organize those practices. What that means, put in plain English, is you would have a habit of picking up a newspaper before you got on the subway in the morning to go to work or school, or you would watch the news in the evening. And those were things that were sort of part of your daily schedule. They were habit driven, and there were organized habits and practices that allowed that to exist. And that this has really changed with the adoption of both the 24/7 news cycle and mobile news consumption, because we have phones, because we no longer need to remember to pick up a paper or turn on a news program for the hour that it's on in the evening. It can come to us at various moments when we are unscheduled. And you get on the train without having to think about it. And then you open your phone while you're on the train instead of having to purchase it, or you scroll in bed instead of watching the nightly news. And that this has had a different kind of impact and on how we are consuming the news and how we're understanding what we're consuming in some ways. This also relates more to our next reading, but I also shared with you guys a video that I think is quite helpful and hopefully funny in understanding some of these changes. That was from close to around the same time that this study was conducted. It was a John Oliver episode on HBO of Last Week Tonight, talking about how some of these critical changes in the news have happened. And he's going to talk a little bit more about what Caitlin Petrie, our next reading, will discuss, but still helpful for, I think, also understanding the context that our article on Incidental News is really trying to address. So for our second reading, you had two chapters, both chapters 1 and 2 of Caitlin Petrie's All the News That's Fit to Click. Caitlin Petrie is currently an assistant professor. Actually, I think she might have moved up, but she's a professor here at Rutgers University. She's extremely nice. She teaches in the School of Communication and Information, and you can take classes with her, and she does some really phenomenal work. A lot of what Caitlin talks about is journalism in the public sphere and how this has changed with digital media and social media in particular. She says that journalism was historically understood to be set apart from the pressures of government and corporate influence, and that for democracy to function, it was understood that there needed to be a kind of separate public sphere to hold elected officials accountable and business people as well, and corporate interests, right? To make these things visible to the public through a lens that wasn't directed by either massive corporations or the government. And this is where you have the concept of the fourth estate, is what journalism has historically been referred to as essentially like an external branch of not government, but a way in which democracy exists through an extra governmental body that holds the government in check. That was the understanding of journalism for a very long time. And journalists understood that they were there upholding the purpose of journalism and democracy, and saw themselves as separate from either the government or corporations in many ways, and that there's a sort of professional distance or autonomy that developed as an industry norm in relationship to this. And again, we will see this reflected in the Last Week Tonight story when he's talking about kind of these critical moments in investigative journalism that were really important to exposing corruption in government or collaborations between the government and corporations that were bad for the people. There's an idea that journalists were an autonomous body that were responsible for that and have these kind of heroic narratives sometimes, right? He's pointing to some of those narratives as the history of journalism, or at least a romantic remembrance of it. And so the idea was that you would have a reporter working on their own story. They would often be referred to as beat reporters. They were self-directed and uninhibited by the pressures of either the political or economic concern, because you were hired as a beat journalist. So you just got hired and then you got to go work on stories. And it was not like it is now. We'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, where there's like a gig economy almost. A lot of writers get paid per piece. They don't actually have beat jobs any longer. They're not permanently hired by a newspaper where they get to go work on things over time and develop sources and storylines and things that they're committed to and specific knowledges. Instead, there's this very gig-based, product-based approach, and that this has caused some real significant changes in how journalists work and how we are experiencing the news as a result. And she obviously ties all of this to both the 24/7 news cycle and the emergence of social media as the critical way that people are receiving news, right? So she's coming after our previous article by a couple of years and looking at the impact of what that means, that scrolling economy of like, how is it that I determine what I'm going to read in the news, what I'm going to pay attention to, what I'm going to click on? Caitlin argues that the move from traditional newsrooms to online newsrooms created a new business environment as well as a new method and mode of us receiving news. Yeah. So profit margins were smaller. Editors were under more pressure from the business side of operations, right? From the finance department, from coming in, right? From human resources to determine how what they were doing was more profitable or not. So whether or not a story was profitable, whether or not it became interesting to people was suddenly very important in a way that it hadn't been, right? She lays out in our chapters for us the way that historically in that kind of heyday age of the autonomy of newspaper journalists with that they did not really particularly mind or care what people thought of the stories they were telling. The point was to get them out there. And they certainly weren't considering whether or not their story was selling. And suddenly there's this big shift and there's this huge amount of financial pressure. And that then changes journalism and the way journalists are thinking about themselves as professionals and how they're having to then behave and work, how they have to pursue jobs and maintain their jobs, right? The different, much more tenuous, much more precarious position than it had been historically. And arguably, that has a huge impact on the kind of stories that you are then willing to pursue and put before your editor. Because then you have to think not only is this interesting, is this important, which might have been the questions you asked in the past, but now you have to ask, are they going to find this profitable so that I will then continue to be hired, right? So that I'm seen to be contributing to the profit of the newspaper. It's a very different perspective to be working under and a really difficult one. One of the things that Petru points out is that there's also some complexities in this idea of journalistic autonomy, right? The idea that like journalists don't, quote unquote, don't care what their audiences think about them, right? The ambivalent and conflicted relationship to audiences. And now, under current systems and to metrics, she's saying that this is a long tension within journalism, and it's just been escalated in a unique way now. And it's made more apparent, obviously, by the financial precarity that journalists are experiencing that they hadn't had previously. And when I say that they hadn't had previously, the people who were allowed to be journalists, right? Something that's going to come up for a lot for us next week is that who these people are, who it was that got to be beat journalists who were hired and then let go to have whatever kinds of thoughts and ideas they wanted to have within relative freedom under their editors, was also bound to a history of who it was that ever got to be in the newsroom in the first place, right? Who got to be the editors, who they hired as journalists. These were typically white men from Ivy League universities or similar. It was not a common thing for that kind of freedom to be given to people of color, to women, right? Those things changed at various points. We got a little bit more freedom, but it's worth noting that the moment at which there's diversity in our newsrooms is also the moment at which the assessment of the value of the journalists' contributions becomes much more fine-tuned and much more laser focused on by the corporations that have come to control the news media. She uses Chartbeat as a case study. What Chart was a news analytics company that built real-time tracking of metrics of like how many shares, how many likes stories we're getting. So you would be in the newsroom, and this here on the bottom right-hand side, this image, this is what would have been essentially on the wall. And you can see it here in the other photographs of the actual office space. You can see the list of metrics in the corner, right? So there would have been these monitors. And like being on a stock exchange, you as a journalist would be faced with this kind of constant measuring of the success of the story that you just posted on the website for the news media entity that you worked for. And Chartbeat was very popular. And it experienced rapid growth in the early 2010s. And a lot of people had very ambivalent feelings about it. Some people really liked it. People who worked in the industry who were very successful with it found it fun. Others had really big problems with it. And largely, a lot of the issues with it is that it set the tone for how people were going to write stories and come up with content going forward, right? Because you start to see patterns. If you have this really large scale quantitative metric system in front of you that's real-time updating constantly, it's going to dictate the kinds of choices that you make, right? Because you see what's working. And if your income, if your job is tied to that, it changes the choices that you make. Again, John Oliver has some fun jokes about this, about like puppies or the kinds of things that get people to click on stories and how those things have to be. He has a clip of an owner of a news site screaming at journalists about this. So you'll see that this has some real impacts, right? And changes the way a lot of these news sites work. Dr. Caitlin Petrie did some of her field work at the New York Times. This is an image of the building from the outside and from the inside. This is directly across the street from the Port Authority in New York City, if you've ever been. The New York Times is, of course, one of our longest standing traditional news media. Traditional newspapers obviously was print originally. But in 2010, when they adopted the subscription pay model in the early 2010s, they also started using Chartbeat after that point in order to determine what was keeping people or getting people to subscribe. And so they could continue to make money when people were not really buying newspapers anymore physically. Again, something that's talked about in great detail in that John Oliver video. So on the other end of the spectrum, the other site that she looks at pretty closely is Gawker. Gawker was an online startup news media platform, and it was there very much to challenge legacy media like the New York Times. It built its business on social media and branding, and it was designed to be posted and shared on social media, like stories were written specifically for that. And as a result, it was one of the earliest adopters of Chartbeat, and perhaps its success was perhaps one of the reasons why places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal were pushed to feel that they had to compete with them and also utilize Chartbeat, right? And she talks a lot about the culture of Gawker and the culture of these kinds of workplaces as being hyper competitive and really driven, and how the dashboard function of Chartbeat as something that like looms large in the room ended up being a big factor in how people were experiencing their workplaces at Gawker. She later in the book also talks about how Gawker essentially caves and Chartbeat is no more as well. And she describes how that is and why that might be, about what these kinds of models are and were and how they became pretty untenable, right? And like the quest of hunting down viral stories and what that kind of did to a lot of young writers. The rest of the book is a good read if this is something that's interesting to you. She also has some good posts online that you can check out too. She's very active on Twitter. She also has some videos on YouTube describing a lot of what she saw in the process of doing this research. She's looking at how all of these shifting conditions of how we consume news based on what we saw in our first article of incidental news consumption, clickbait, the shift away from habitual practices like buying a newspaper, how these have impacted how the companies have tried to stay afloat, how they've tried to financialize and digitize the news in ways to make sure that they retain their profits, and the impact that this has had on journalists and on their working environments. And so she says it's important for us to think about what our position is in relationship to this. And also John Oliver will point this out, that it's our responsibility as consumers of the news to help make sure that our news is honest and isn't beholden entirely to the economic forces that it's under at the particular moment, because he's basically advocating to subscribe to a paper. You, by the way, may not know this, but all of you have subscriptions through our library, through the Alexander Library, to both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. If you have any questions about how to get that set up for yourself so that you can just log on and see those very easily, please let me know. I'm happy to walk you guys through it. But it's an important resource that you have access to, and I don't think our library does a very good job of letting you know that you have that access. Anyway, back to this. Caitlin Petrie argues that working conditions have not only affected journalists' abilities to perform their normative social role, which we talked about as the fourth estate, the watchdog for the government and corporations, but that those shifts are also shaping the development and expression of norms, values, and practices in ways that are both indirect and direct, that happens through how we understand our world based on what we're reading and what we're seeing in the news media around us. We have huge impacts from the effects of their shifting working conditions, right? The fact that they need to think now of creating a product rather than performing a social service impacts the way that they're writing, impacts what we are then reading and how we're understanding the world as a result. This ties into something we'll talk about next week when we get into citizen journalism. But she also points out that journalists have increasingly understood their work as labor as a result of all of this, and that they have organized accordingly. What that means is that when they saw themselves as performing a social service, but also maybe in a kind of elitist way, as previously noted, depending, like indicated by where they were coming from culturally, often, they tended not to think of themselves as workers. They were many journalists were allies to workers, right? So when you saw worker strikes across the country in the 30s, oftentimes journalists were hugely sympathetic. Investigative journalists in the 20s and 30s were incredibly important to exposing the exploitation of corporations and businesses of their workers and helped enable workers' movements. But they themselves did not typically think of themselves as workers, and they weren't organized as workers in most instances. And what Petrie's pointing out is that as work is being codified and valued in this financialization and digitization of journalism and stories, journalists are left thinking of themselves more as workers as their work has been piecemealed out and determined. And, you get paid such and such for this much for this story, depending on how many clicks you're getting, versus you have a salaried position and you work on developing a beat or whatever that is, right? Because of the way the work has changed, pushed more journalists into organizing and seeing themselves as laborers. And so we're seeing infinitely more strikes. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post have struck in recent years. And just like we see also with creative industries, the writers' strike among television and film writers, we're going to see more and more of this because as corporations in control of these medias construct a new way of financializing and trying to make profits off of quote unquote content, right? We're no longer telling stories. We're no longer writing news. We're creating content for tech companies. And under that, we are seen as interchangeable, disposable, et cetera, right? Because the content it almost doesn't matter to them, to the people who now control these industries, these tech companies, what it is that we're creating, right? What our content is. And so that then means that journalists are much more inclined to see themselves as workers and to organize as such. And there's a lot of possibility and a lot of potential in that, despite the fact that it means that people are having to struggle through a lot of precarity at the moment. Anyway, so I wanted to thank all of you before I leave this lecture off for the day. We tried to keep it short today. I wanted to thank all of you for your very thoughtful, in many instances, proposals. It was great to meet so many of you. I've really enjoyed hearing what you're thinking about. You'll have a small survey next week where you can say a little bit more about your experiences. I'm going to go through your proposals tomorrow night and Friday to get a sense of where we're at, and I will get them back to you and graded. So if anything needs to change, you have a little bit of time to do it. I will take resubmissions and up your grades if there's problems, or if there's anything that's just maybe missing or it needs a little bit of fine tuning. Your very first journal entry for your observation, for your data collection, is this week. I will see those at the end of the week, and I'm excited about those too. And you will eventually be sharing those with each other. For the first week, they are just for you sending them to me. But we're going to start doing peer review of journal entries so that you can get a sense of whether or not what you're trying to convey from your notes is making it across to an audience member who's less familiar with your project, and see if they're able to understand. Again, my great pleasure meeting many of you. I hope you're doing okay. I know it's been a very difficult time. We will talk more next week about social media and citizen journalism. And I know a lot of things are going to come up for people about what it is that we're seeing in the news. I want you to feel free to speak, but I also want us to remember to be incredibly thoughtful with one another. And if you have any questions or concerns, and if for any reason you are feeling unsafe, or if there's something going on that you need to talk about, please reach out to me. I'm always here to listen. Okay. I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.